Charles Dunst is an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Dunst regularly publishes in the media and has written opinion articles for outlets like the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and the Council on Foreign Relations. He has worked as a foreign correspondent in Cambodia, reporting for the New York Times, the Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and the Los Angeles Times. Now an associate of the Asia Group, an advisory firm focusing on government affairs and commercial partnerships. Charles is the author of a new book, Defeating the Dictators: How Democracy Can Prevail in the Age of the Strongman. So we're here interviewing him today at the LSE, where he's actually a graduate. Welcome, Charles.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll just jump right in. I wanted to discuss a little first about your time as a foreign correspondent. A lot of us learn a lot of theoretical knowledge in our degree, but oftentimes it takes really being on the ground to really put that into practice and to see these theories show up in reality. So during your time as a foreign correspondent, and now as an associate with the Asia Group, you've studied and reported extensively on Southeast Asia, an area that's often neglected in foreign policy discussions. Can you tell us a bit about what you've learned about the region, and what role do you see Southeast Asia playing in the world in the next decade?
Sure. Well, I moved to Cambodia, I guess, in 2018. So end of 20, or early, let's see if I get this right. Mid 2018, so September 2018, to work for a small magazine owned by a German but published in English, with the notion of basically being a very junior reporter, kind of do whatever they assigned to me, and then on the side write as much for American outlets as possible. And I had lived abroad before. I lived in Hungary, and I wanted to be a journalist, and the advice I got was go to Southeast Asia. It's this young, vibrant region. There's a lot going on. There is increased foreign interest, and there are a lot of stories. So my time in Cambodia was really helpful for a variety of reasons. I think, I was in Cambodia before I came and did my master's here at the LSE, and having that background kind of in real on-the-ground knowledge before coming to do a master's was really beneficial, where my classmates here would joke that every time there was a discussion on anything like peace building or refugees or whatnot, I would always bring up Cambodia. And it was this ongoing joke, and I was like, well, I'd bring up Cambodia because I know Cambodia well. Whereas I was studying with a lot of people who perhaps hadn't lived outside of their own countries before, or were coming straight out of undergrad, and having that on-the-ground experience was really helpful because I kind of focused on a bunch of issues when I was in Cambodia. And I reported as well from Myanmar and Vietnam, which kind of pose their own challenges. But I focused on refugee issues, particularly in Cambodia and Vietnam, where the United States has for the last 20-odd years deported a number of folks back to those countries who came to the United States as refugees, which is this complicated issue in the States. I focused on that. I focused on China's increased kind of influence in those two countries in the region more broadly. And then in Myanmar, I focused kind of oddly enough on Israel-Myanmar ties, which is kind of a neglected bit of history. But just having that on-the-ground experience, particularly as a journalist, where you're on a deadline, such a harsh deadline, where it's, I need 1,600 words by tomorrow. And having that experience has made it much easier for me in the kind of analysis world, in the think tank world, to put together pieces very quickly. And put together good pieces very quickly, or put together a book in a fairly quick turnaround. So in terms of both topics and just skill set, being a journalist abroad was incredibly helpful. And I recommend to everyone who has even like a fleeting interest in journalism to go be some type of foreign correspondent abroad, whether it's freelance or otherwise, and folks who are interested in really anywhere, go do Peace Corps if you're American, things along those lines. I think living in a developing country is only a good thing when you come back to your country, whether you're from Germany, the UK, US. If you want to work in foreign policy in the future, having an experience in a country very much different from your own can only be helpful as you kind of rise the ranks, I guess.
Certainly. So recently we've seen, as US-China tensions heat up, there's a much greater emphasis on discussing how these two powers might face each other in Southeast Asia. I think recently we've seen the US ramp up its involvement in the Philippines, for example, and we see both of them vying over influence over Indonesia. Based on your time in Southeast Asia, where do you see this? How do you see this playing out? So where do you see the role of Southeast Asia going in the next decade or so?
Well, I think there's this critical distinction that Americans are increasingly making, but have struggled to do for a long time. When we think about Southeast Asia, there's this thought of the country as the region is basically just a proxy battle. Kind of, we only think of Southeast Asia vis-a-vis China, and there's clearly a need to think about the region in its own rights. I mean, Vietnam is a growing economic power. Indonesia is physically a huge country. These are countries that are going to have a massive economic importance to the United States going forward, just in terms of export markets, import markets, all that. There's clearly a need to engage them on their own rights. And in terms of US-China competition, I think these countries, with the exception perhaps of Laos and to some extent of Cambodia, that are broadly more China-aligned but still welcome US engagement, these countries have kind of found themselves in this odd balancing position, where even you think about the Philippines, you think about Vietnam, where they don't necessarily trust the Chinese government in terms of security issues. So Vietnam will ramp up defense engagement with the United States because they're worried about China kind of above them, or China in the South China Sea. But they, at the same time, turn to China for economic backing and for trade, because the United States, since Trump came to power, is really hesitant to do any type of free trade agreement. We left TPP, we're not in RCEP, we're not in CPTPP, there is no real push to do a proper free trade agreement with Southeast Asia, when frankly that's all Southeast Asia wants. If you talk to the average mid-level diplomat from Vietnam or from Indonesia or from Singapore and Washington, they'll tell you their number one focus is getting an FTA, but domestic US political sentiment against FTAs has made it very difficult. So it's a long way of saying that the countries in the region are very much balancing, but balancing in a somewhat odd way, where they're basically relying on China to get rich and relying on America to protect them from China because they don't trust China at the same time. And my belief is that we're going to be kind of stuck in that position until something changes pretty substantially, and that change would have to be something very drastic, like the United States saying we want to do free trade agreements again, which seems highly unlikely, or a war over Taiwan, or any type of Taiwan contingency, because that would basically force someone like the Philippines, or someone like Thailand, or even someone like Singapore, which is not a US ally technically, but houses some US military, to basically make a choice. Because if the United States says, hi, we want to access our military facility in Thailand, or our military facility in the Philippines, or our boats in Singapore, in the kind of the wake of the Taiwan contingency, those countries are going to come under immense pressure from China, economic pressure, to deny that access. Because China can say, hey, we'll cut off all Filipino exports to China in response, which would have a real economic ramification. And I don't know how those countries would lean as of right now. I mean, I think perhaps the Philippines would side with the United States. Singapore, I don't know. Singapore, I think, is kind of a toss-up, but probably maybe like 51-49 leaning towards China. But I do think the broad positioning of the region is of balancing, because even Cambodia and Laos, which have long been considered the most China-aligned in the region, Cambodia has hired a bunch of lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to boost their reputation in Washington, because they want better ties to the United States. They want U.S. private sector investment, because I think there's this awareness of, well, why would we balance, or why would we choose China so explicitly when we can balance the United States and China and extract economic benefits from both? Because clearly you're better off, like being a Thailand or being a Philippines, kind of playing the two off one another to get more aid, to get more security interest. So I think that is kind of the state of play, at least for the foreseeable future, until there's some drastic shift, either in US politics or geopolitically or security-wise in the region.
Interesting. You mentioned something that I think was quite profound, which is that a lot of the time when we do discuss these countries in international relations discourse, it's in relation to a superpower or a superpower conflict. But I do think it's valuable to look at what it's like, living in these countries, kind of without considering the influence of China and the U.S. So I wanted to zoom in on one country in particular, Myanmar. I think they're called Burma now. So over the past couple of years, especially in 2020, there was quite a tumultuous period in that country, in which we saw, a world leader that formerly had, or that supposedly had the Nobel Peace Prize, face very autocratic forces, some of which were her own making. And so, one criticism, or I guess one observation that a lot of pundits made, was that in Myanmar or Burma, difficulties implementing democracy were perhaps due to a lack of democratic norms and values that which often take a long time to foster. Would you agree with this observation? And if not, what would you credit the difficulty in, I guess, democratization in that country to?
I mean, I think the difficulty stems from the fact that Myanmar has never really been a coherent political unit in the sense of even a kind of the best periods of state control. I mean, best in terms of when was the country most stable. They only controlled, the government, the central government only controlled about 2/3 of the country. I mean, there has been a civil war for 75 years. From the end of British colonialism, the country's never been a solidified unit. So the idea that you're going to have a kind of proper modern democracy in a country like that seems very difficult from the outset. And even, I mean, you can have democracy in perhaps the other 2/3 of the country. And I think before the genocide, they were on largely the right track. I think there were, I mean, the elections were reasonably free and fair, despite the fact that the military had, I think it's 25% of the seats, elected seats basically just blocked off for them. That was part of the deal of the democratic transition, was they got this hold on power, this kind of check, this undemocratic check, as basically for them giving up complete power. And that was a trade-off that the world made, basically saying we would prefer an imperfect democracy under Aung San Suu Kyi than we would a kind of complete dictatorship in Myanmar. And clearly that trade-off didn't necessarily work. But I'm not, it's hard to be critical because it's hard to say what else could foreign powers have done to have helped Myanmar. I mean, the options were this kind of quasi-democratic system or a harsh autocracy, and I think you'd always choose quasi-democratic. But the issue, I mean, there are many issues, but I think one of the number one issues that is always stark for me in Myanmar is I think Western policymakers were not necessarily aware of Aung San Suu Kyi's broad unwillingness to stand up for minorities like the Rohingya. I think there was this veneration of her as the Nobel Peace Prize winner, as this human rights defender, without an understanding that this is, if this is now a quasi-democratic country, she's going to face democratic pressures. And in the same way, American and British and German politicians come under pressure to stand up against immigration, or stand up against or stand on very complex ethnic issues. She, to a much greater degree, had to kind of stand against the Rohingya because the public doesn't approve of the Rohingya. I mean, the public thinks, oh, they're just Bangladeshis, they're Bengalis, they're not actually part of the country. So the West, I don't want to say it was purposeful, because I don't think it was, but I think, frankly, there's a dearth of people with real knowledge of Myanmar, which is part of the reason. I mean, the country was closed for so long. It was hard to get in, it was hard to really write anything about it, it was hard to better understand it. And there's a whole generation of foreign policy people who are so focused on the Middle East, or so focused on China, that Southeast Asia took a backseat. And Myanmar, within Southeast Asia, took even the most of a backseat. So there wasn't, I think, a super coherent set of Western understandings going into Myanmar. And I think that certainly played a role at the shock in 2017 that her government kind of just stood by as the genocide happened, that she went to The Hague and stood up for the military. The military is her longtime adversary, but she kind of did that for domestic political reasons to solidify her relationship with the military and solidify her democratic kind of bona fides. And it didn't work. But Myanmar is such a complicated issue because I'm not sure, if I was sitting in the White House in 2010 and 2011, I'm not sure what I would have done differently. Whereas there's certainly other issues that you look at and say, well, that didn't make sense. But Myanmar, it's almost a problem of its own history. And I think what's unfortunate is, I'm friendly with one or two former U.S. ambassadors to Myanmar, and no one has solutions for the current problem. The solution is for the United States to better engage the armed organizations, but to not provide them weapons, but to kind of provide the government in exile some type of recognition. But this isn't a simple kind of, I don't want to say simple, but this isn't simple like Russia-Ukraine, where it's okay, let's give money to Ukraine, or let's give money and weapons to Ukraine will stand up against Russia.
Right.
Myanmar, who are you giving the weapons to? And will the weapons make the whole situation worse? And I don't have any good answers there, but it is certainly a byproduct of colonialism, and it's a byproduct of the West just not knowing exactly how to handle a very complex country.
Definitely. I think, obviously it's difficult to say that Russia-Ukraine is simple, but in a way, having a clear good guy and bad guy does make the conflict, a lot more straightforward. Well, actually, speaking about, I think this segues nicely into your new book, but speaking about solutions, or I guess the lack thereof, sometimes, to democratization, I think this is an issue that obviously you focus on in your book. Once again, that's defeating the dictators, how democracy can prevail in the age of the strongman. So I wanted to start with this. So you present Hungarian President Viktor Orban as an example of someone who is eroding democratic institutions from within. And in some ways, this perhaps poses a more sinister or a more, how do you call it? Perhaps a greater threat than external threats to democracy. So although Viktor Orban has a strong autocratic streak, he still enjoys very high popular support among Hungarians, right? His party has enjoyed a supermajority for the past decade, and he himself is now in his fourth term. And similarly, I think a lot of other Western movements with similar autocratic streaks also have large followings, right? Whether in Poland, France, or the US. So why do you think that authoritarian has become so popular among the supposedly democratic West?
The issue in my mind is kind of real government incompetence, coupled with economic pain, coupled with a very kind of smart strongman who can string together economic issues with very cultural ones, things like immigration, ethnic nationalism, all that. And I don't think Orban and Trump are exactly the same, but it is a symptom of the similar problem of the governments of the United States, of Hungary, of France to some extent, clearly are not delivering well enough for their people. I mean, you can see, if you look at polls and ask people now, do you think your children will be better off than you are? The answer is less yes than it was 20 years ago, than it was 30 years ago. And my argument in the book is that's not the result of globalization, as I think many people, both on the far right and the far left, would say, is, well, trade was the problem. It was not trade that was the problem, it was the management of trade, in the sense that let's put it this way, when the United States and China traded kind of fairly openly for so long, both countries did get richer. But those riches mostly stayed at the top of societies. I mean, China's income inequality is worse than every country in Europe and is only slightly better than the United States is. So the wealth very much was solidified in the hands of a few people at the top and did not trickle its way down. And it's no surprise to me that when you have economic pain, coupled with someone like Trump or someone like Orban who can actually speak to that pain and then blame that pain on something. Whether for Orban, that's the EU. He's blamed it on the EU, he's blamed it on immigrants, and he's tapped into this Hungarian sense of all of our young people, our smart young people, are moving west. They're getting their degree and they're moving to France, or they're moving to Germany, where they can make more money. So you have this kind of perfect storm in Hungary where older people who remember their country being effectively subsumed into the Soviet Union, now worried about Hungarianness disappearing. They're worried about Hungarian culture disappearing. And at the same time, people are going west as they see more and more immigrants from the Muslim world coming from the east, at the same time that the economy is particularly poor. And in Hungary, there's this really visceral moment of, I believe it was 2010, like 2008 or 2010, where the socialists who had been in power for about a decade were caught basically in an internal party convention, caught saying, well, we lied to win the election, and we lied about our effectiveness, and the country's still corrupt, the economy's not gotten any better, and that speech leaked. That speech leaked, and Orban was promptly into power like less than a year later and has been there since. Because he basically said, look at these leftist crooks ruining the country. So it's actual economic kind of difficulties coupled with this vision of government incompetence, coupled with an ability to connect some type of cultural ethnic issue that I think is what you've seen with Trump. I think it's what you've seen with Orban. I think to some extent it's what you've seen with Brexit. I mean, I think it's very hard to say that the Brexit vote was based on coherent economic thought. I think it was very clearly motivated by cultural issues, by fears of Britain becoming a less English, or the UK broadly becoming a less white place. And I think, certainly there are politicians who or certainly politicians who were supportive of Brexit for other reasons nominally. But I think it's hard to kind of understate the role of it's both economics and it's culture. And I think, I agree with you that the problem is mostly internal rather than external at the moment. I'm not so worried about how is China going to subvert American democracy. I'm worried about American democracy on its own merits.
Right.
Because when you can't get your own houses in order, that's when you become kind of open to foreign exploitation. It's when you can't get your own houses in order, you find it much more difficult to stand up for your values and for your interests abroad. And I think the free trade issue is actually very, very demonstrative of this, where it is very clearly in the United States' national interest to have a free trade agreement with ASEAN or with India, or even with the United Kingdom. I mean, that is very clearly in the American national interest, but politicians are not willing to go along with it because they know their people have a negative view of free trade. Because they say free trade is why my dad lost his job because the job was outsourced to China. And rather than saying, well, the management of free trade was the problem and that the United States government probably didn't provide enough support for worker retraining or for just funds when you lose your job, it's not that they don't have the money, it's that the whole process was mismanaged. And that's too complicated for many politicians to go into their districts and explain. So clearly, I mean, that's kind of a simple example, and not, free trade agreements are not the reason why the United States is going to like decline, and it's not the reason, but it is a problem. So yeah, the problem is mostly internal, and that's kind of point one of the book. Is if we can't get our own houses in order, we're going to feed this autocratic impulse of people who are open to a Trump or open to an Orban, and it's not always the far right people who come along in immigration or ethnic or cultural issues. It is centrists who are saying, well, this center-left system isn't working, let's try something new. And you certainly saw that in the United States, where in 2020, Trump's support among people of color went up, particularly among Muslims and Hispanics went up, despite kind of the fear-mongering, because there's this sense of people prioritizing economic gain over cultural one. So that's problem set one. And problem set two is if the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Japan, etc., are all kind of a mess at home to varying degrees, people in potential democracies or in current autocracies around the developing world won't say, we want to be like the West, or we want to be like Japan, or we want to be like Australia. They're going to look to China and Singapore and the Gulf states, these rich autocracies where if you show up in Singapore or you show up in Dubai, everything kind of works. And I did this kind of exercise a few days ago when I was giving a talk on the book, and I asked a crowd of like 40 people, I said, how many of you have been to Shanghai, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, or Singapore, and how many of you came home and thought that that system was better, or sorry, thought that infrastructure worked better, or that just walking around the streets it felt cleaner than London, or than New York, or than Berlin. And that's a real problem, particularly for people abroad, where if you go to Vietnam and you ask people, well, what development model do you want to follow? Do you want to be more like the United States, or do you want to be more like China or Singapore? The answer is mostly going to be China and Singapore, because people look at things like the UK's three prime ministers in 6 months. People look at January 6th. The people look at Brexit and say, we don't want that. We don't want the kind of complications and the messiness of democracy. So there's this yearning for the kind of idealized functional strongman, which is a rarity. I want to be very, very clear that the idea of calling for a strongman to fix your problems is not realistic. It's not going to work. But I at least understand the sentiment and where it's coming from.
Right, definitely. I think this idea of authoritarianism is extremely seductive. It seems to me that everyone wants to have a magical strongman come in to fix all their problems for them. I think the unfortunate reality that people often realize too late is that usually that's not what strongmen end up doing. One of my friends was in Vienna that other day and ended up speaking to someone who was a strong supporter of their far-right party. And it was particularly interesting to me because this person was quite well educated, very eloquent. And what we gathered from this seems to reflect very much what you're saying about economic pain transferring into wider animosity against whatever narrative, whatever the narrative has set. I think there's this one study I've read that finds that in times of greater economic pain, respondents experience anger before, or just like abstract anger almost, before latching that anger onto a certain group to hate. And so perhaps there's this combination of economic pain that creates anger that then latches onto the popular narratives at the time. I think there's also something to be said, at least based on my friend's conversation with this right-wing nationalist, about voting for the far right almost as a revenge vote. I think a lot of the working class now, whether it's in the US or in Austria or in the UK, feels betrayed by the supposed left, right? The neoliberals, as it were. I really see what you're saying in that sense. So we just spoke about perhaps some of the causes of of internal threats to democracy, this sort of institutional rot almost. And it's a lot easier to see perhaps the clear, severe, prevalent external threats to democracy, right? It's very easy to see that Vladimir Putin is invading Ukraine, that China is stepping up belligerence against Taiwan and against its, for example, in the South China Sea. But some of the internal threats to democracy that we perceive today are a lot more complicated, and in some ways they seem, I think in some ways those are the problems that really make people despair about whether democracy is going to work out in the future, right? So whether it's Roe v. Wade being overturned in the U.S. or the anti-protest bill in the U.K. Or any slew of new anti-democratic policies, it seems less like democracy is now finally rotting away, and more like democracy is almost reverting to where it's always been, right? If we look at the very short history of democracy, the vast majority of it has not been really that democratic, right? In the U.S., for example, the Civil Rights Act wasn't passed till '64, gay marriage wasn't legalized till 2008, and now only around a decade after gay marriage was legalized, now suddenly Roe v. Wade has been overturned, and so. It seems like democracy is going back to where it's always been. So how do you remain hopeful that it's even possible to achieve this supposed better democracy?
I remain hopeful because when you look at the social science, it's actually very clear that if you live in a democracy, you are much more likely to live a longer life, to be richer, to be healthier, and to have a richer cultural life. I mean, there's a reason why when you travel around the world and you see, okay, well, what movies are on TV, or what books are people reading, or what art are people so invested in? In many cases, particularly in Southeast Asia, it's American movies, or it's South Korean music, or it's Japanese novels. It's very rarely, even in Southeast Asia, which is China's backyard, Chinese music has not made much of a dent. Chinese films have not made much of a dent. And it's not to say that people in autocracies can't innovate and can't write rich books or, create really wonderful TV or movies. I mean, of course not. But if you live in a democracy still, even in kind of our very complicated, messy democracies, you are more likely to live longer, to live a more richer cultural life, and you are more likely to produce one of these innovations that changes the world. Right. So the issue is not democracy on its head. The issue is our faith in democracy's automatic functioning. The notion that after the 1990s, or kind of after the fall of the Soviet Union, that everything would just work. That we didn't need to kind of so seriously continually reform our systems because the other system on offer, the Soviet kind of communist system, had fallen. And there was this, I think, complacency of, well, this is the era of globalization, it's the era of free trade, everyone's going to get richer. As I said before, countries got richer, but people didn't get richer. So I remain optimistic because on the whole, democracy is still the best system on offer. I remain thoroughly unconvinced by the notion that a Chinese dictator or the leader, or even a collective kind of leadership of Singapore can provide a better life everywhere. I'm thoroughly kind of against that, which is basically why I wrote the book and basically laid out these 8 very specific ways that you can reform your democracies that are very different and kind of very different for each country, where I think one of the really key ones I talked about was accountability and governance. Because too often across the West, and even in somewhere like South Korea, you don't really see people holding former leaders accountable. I mean, South Korea gets like half the equation right in that I think it's 4 recent presidents who've been sent to prison on corruption charges, but then they're all eventually pardoned. Whereas I think this weird positive example that you wouldn't think of is in Malaysia. Malaysia has sent their former prime minister to prison on very obvious corruption charges, and everyone expected him to get pardoned because the king is a friend of his, and they just haven't pardoned him yet. And it's actually a very positive example, I think, of holding leaders accountable and making it very clear to the public that there are not 2 sets of laws, that there isn't laws for the rich elite people and laws for everyone else. And that was part of the problem, I think, certainly in the United States, where a whole swath of representatives trade stocks kind of quasi-illegally and just kind of get away with it and maybe pay a few fines, but nothing like the insider trading rap that they would surely face if they were a normal person. Or in the UK, when Boris basically ignored all of his own COVID rules that he laid out for the entire population, and that if you were a normal person, you were going to face some kind of punishment for it. So I think accountability is a clear one, very important one, and accountability links very much so to trust in government, where the countries around the world that post the highest levels of popular trust in government are all autocracies. So it's the UAE, it's Singapore, it's China, it's Vietnam. And the question is why? It's because that government actually, people think the government is delivering. And people think the government is being honest with them, even if it's a repressive state. So when COVID started, the Vietnamese government was very explicit to their people, saying, this is going to be really difficult economically, but we need you to go home, we need you to shut down, so people don't die. And their containment strategy worked for about a year and a half because they had such high levels of trust in government. Whereas across the West, and even in democracies like India and in South Korea and Japan, you saw people protesting against COVID measures fairly early. So, and I think so it's merit, it's accountability. I mean, meritocracy is one that I focused on too, where I know it's kind of popular now to be anti-meritocratic, this notion that meritocracy leads to burnout and all that. But I think it's a real problem that we have this notion that people's governments are not being staffed meritocratically, where in the US there's this vision of, okay, you know, these 4,000 political appointees, they're always the president. With Trump, it was the president's literal children, otherwise. But it's politically aligned people who know the right people, not necessarily the most qualified people. And so it's kind of government staffing, but it's also meritocracy at the lower levels, where Singapore, to its credit, extends much more financial assistance and just other educational assistance to low-income schools. So if you're a very smart child in a low-income school, you are more likely to succeed and then get advanced to a pretty quality secondary school. And if you're really, really intelligent at secondary school and perform really, really well, the government will give you a scholarship to study at Oxford, or to study at the LSE, or to study at Harvard in return for coming back to Singapore and working in the government. And it's like 4 of the 5 last trade ministers all come from that background. 2 of the country's more famous foreign ministers come from that background and are not Chinese Singaporean, despite that being the notion that Chinese Singaporeans kind of dominate the system. There does seem to be more opportunity for folks in the lower income rungs, where in the United States and the United Kingdom, it's extraordinarily rare to have a president or a prime minister come from anything but an upper class background. I mean, it's the trope in the United Kingdom that I think it's every recent prime minister went to Oxford and all the men went to Eton. I mean, it just feeds this popular distrust where people say, well, these people are coming from this self-selected group of elites that don't seem to be governing super well. So this need to kind of make this whole system more meritocratic and ensuring that the actually super intelligent people and super well-meaning people who do perform well can actually rise to power. So I won't run through all of the solutions. I think those are some of the key ones. And another key one that is particularly salient in the UK is immigration, where there are no Western economies, and I'm talking broader West, so Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, not a single one posts birth rates or fertility rates at the level that demographers say is necessary to maintain a functional balance. So demographers say you need every woman to have 2.1 children. You can't have 2.1 children, but the notion being like that average is what's needed to maintain a functional balance. The United Kingdom is closer to 1.5. The US is closer to 1.6. South Korea and Japan are closer to 1.1 and 1.2. And there's no real solution to that as of now. I mean, South Korea and Japan have for years rolled out all these policies and giving more money and kind of giving state subsidies to basically motivate families to have more children. Because you need more children, you need a more equitable or more kind of functional balance of demographics to ensure that more when basically in 20 years, if 60% of the population is old, young people are going to have to spend more of their tax dollars. The government's going to have to spend more of people's tax dollars on elderly care. They're going to either have to take more tax dollars, which is always a problem, or they're going to have to divert spending from other priorities like defense. And neither one of those is a particularly good option, and it's been shown over and over again that super old populations like that will stagnate growth. And my argument is that stagnated growth for years on end will only kind of enable the potential rise of authoritarians. And this is really a problem, honestly, mostly for South Korea and Japan, where there's much more hesitance to take immigrants than there is in the West. I mean, of course, American and British headlines can seem very incendiary, but I think the stat that's in the book that's quite eye-opening is in 2018, so the last fully pre-COVID year, Hungary, not known for being pro-immigrant, Hungary took something like 60% more immigrants per capita than did Japan. And that's quite staggering when you think about it. And Hungary is kind of they basically say, well, we don't want certain types of immigrants. I mean, there's all this anti-Muslim bias. They take a lot of Vietnamese immigrants or a lot of other Southeast Asian immigrants to basically make the country work. I mean, to work in restaurants, to work in basic shops. And there's clearly a need to take more immigrants. I mean, it's fairly obvious to me, and this is not a case, I have to say over and over again, it's not a case for open borders. I mean, I don't think that's a reasonable solution to anything, but it is a case for smart borders, where to a variety of extents, the democracy's immigration systems are either just broken or deeply flawed. I mean, I would argue that the US system is completely broken, where it's incredibly difficult to keep a very highly skilled immigrant in the country unless the employer will sponsor the visa, and that can cost $20,000, and there are all these difficulties that make it really hard, whereas Australia and France's immigration policies are explicitly based on keeping people away, where it scares off immigrants and makes people more likely to go to Germany or more likely to go to the United States. I mean, I think about kind of the Prime Minister here, the Prime Minister's plans to stop people who cross the English channel from claiming asylum. Well, that's going to make them more likely to go elsewhere.
Right.
And native-born Britons are not producing enough people for the country to really afford that. And stat after stat shows that immigrants are also far more entrepreneurial than native-born citizens. They create businesses at a higher rate, and they actually often pay more in taxes because they tend to often be wealthier. So it's not to say that every immigrant is going to come here and found Google, like the founder of Sergey Brin is from Russia, from Soviet Union, and founded Google in the United States, and clearly the United States benefits. But on the whole, there's a very obvious need for immigration to boost democracy's economies and kind of make sure we are strong enough internally to stand up for our values, both at home and abroad.
Yeah. One last question.
Yeah.
To round out our discussion of your new book. You discuss that to combat the institutional rot that threatens our democracy, we have to learn from our rivals as well. Besides meritocracy, which you've already mentioned, what are some other things that you think we need to learn from our more autocratic rivals?
I think there's this really, really, really good stat that from 1992 or 1982, I think it's 1992 through 2011, China every year spent more on infrastructure than the United States did during the New Deal. And that's clearly a benefit. I mean, China was obviously starting from a lower kind of starting point than the United States was, where we've just had more infrastructure, more modern infrastructure for a longer time. So China basically had this ability to roll out vast amounts of state funds to build highways, basic kind of infrastructure you need. But now, China's spending much more money on digital infrastructure. They're spending money on wiser projects. I mean, for years, and Japan is kind of similar, there was this space, every time there's an economic downturn, the state would roll out money to build infrastructure projects, but oftentimes they would just build them and then the next crisis take them down because they weren't useful ones. I mean, Japan is kind of known for these bridges to nowhere that are not actually serving anyone's purpose, but are basically employing people in times of economic downturn. The West's economy is deteriorating, the West's infrastructure is deteriorating, and you can see it in Japan too. I mean, even Japan, which is probably has the best infrastructure in the democratic world, probably, the bridges are going to need repairs. The tunnels have collapsed. A few tunnels have collapsed in recent years. There's a need to rebuild that infrastructure, but also to focus on future-focused infrastructure. Where, I mean, to his credit, President Biden has passed this big infrastructure bill, but the bill is mostly focused on things like bridges or things like tunnels. Whereas, what's the deal about putting, more of our infrastructure on the cloud, or extending internet to rural parts of the country, which will surely boost economic growth, as study after study shows. And this is not to say that we should replicate China's system at all, but the broad-based focus on infrastructure is clearly a positive one. I mean, there's this notion of the biggest, richest cities in the world are that way because of early infrastructure. So Paris and London exist as they are today because of the Roman infrastructure that was built to make them economic centers. I mean, it's London, but it could have been Brighton. There's no reason for it to have been London besides the fact that infrastructure was built to bring people here. So I can't overstate the importance of infrastructure, and certainly China's not the only one. I mean, Singapore's infrastructure is excellent. I was recently in the UAE and Abu Dhabi, Dubai. This infrastructure is really quite brilliant, and I think there's a need to focus on future-focused infrastructure at home in a similar way, not only to boost our own growth, but to make sure that when people from Vietnam or from Cambodia come to the United States, or they come to Japan, or they come to the United Kingdom, they say, wow, London, New York, San Francisco, they're amazing. We want to be like this. Whereas now, I think if you are from Vietnam and you study in Tokyo, and you study in Shenzhen, and you study in New York, or you work in one of those three places, you are not going to say New York has the best infrastructure. You're probably not going to say Tokyo has the best infrastructure either. And that's a kind of a real, just an image problem for democracy. So it's again, it's about hitting those two streams of performance at home and boosting our image abroad.
Right. Well, I'd love to, discuss your book at length. Unfortunately, we have a time limit on how long these videos can feasibly be. So if our viewers want to, learn more about these ideas, they can check out your new book, Defeating the Dictators: How Democracy Can Prevail in the Age of the Strongman. I believe it should be available in bookstores, libraries.
Amazon, of course.
Yeah. There's been some glowing reviews already, and I hope you can tell Charles is talking about some of perhaps the most pressing issue of our time. As William McCaskill wrote recently in Foreign Affairs, we are sort of at the beginning of history, which is the opposite of Fukuyama's the end of history. And in this beginning of history, it's exceedingly important that we make the right choices so that the countless generations to come will actually exist and won't be wiped out. So I think that wraps up our interview for today. One more reminder, do check out Defeating the Dictators: How Democracy Can Prevail in the Age of the Strongman. And thank you, Charles, for coming.
Thanks for having me.